Charlie Hebdo and the Jewish supermarket murders in Paris, and not to mention events such as the killings in Denmark last weekend, have yet again brought Muslims in Europe under the spotlight. Last month, Eric Pickles, Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, fired off a letter to around 1,000 Muslim faith leaders, provoking the Muslim Council of Britain, to quote their spokesman, to take issue with the implementation, the implications really, that extremism takes place at mosques and that the Muslims have not done enough to challenge the terrorism that took place in our name, and that Muslims and Islam are inherently apart from British society, that Muslims must go out of their way to prove their loyalty to their country of, to this country of ours. And that's what, just to paraphrase what the Muslim Council of Britain spokespersons were saying. So the siren voices of those referring to the existence of a fifth column within our country, for instance, Nigel Farage of UKIP, were again ringing loudly. What I believe that we are witnessing here is the latest bout of popular and official political discourse on the questions of loyalties, which has emerged over the last 2 decades, particularly in relation to Muslims. This has happened in the context of wars in Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, the Yemen, Syria, and most recently ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, where Western powers have intervened militarily against predominantly Muslim peoples. And this complex scenario has clearly raised serious concerns regarding Muslim loyalties in contemporary Britain. Historically speaking, however, it could be argued that we have been at a similar juncture before. If we quickly rewind to explore the encounter between Britain and the Muslim world, as it was developing about a century ago, we can see some striking parallels. Then as now, an extensive range of people and social groups in Britain, including the media, the general public, and politicians alike, manifested aspects of what we now call Islamophobia, and that is fear-mongering, negative stereotyping, abuse in their attitudes and behavior. It was reflected in official policy documents, the voices of state institutions and of those holding authoritative positions. Pan-Islam, that is a support for the notion of a wider Muslim identity unfettered by national boundaries, and the defense of the Ottoman Caliphate, and then the Turkish Sultan, were viewed as un-British. The flip side to this scenario was the perception among groups of Muslims living in Britain that European powers, including Britain itself, had declared war on Islam more generally, and hence it was their duty to resist this new onslaught. For many of these British Muslims, this defiance assumed the guise of various forms of political Islam, or what we today call Islamism. In my lecture this evening, I want to explore how Muslims juggled these kinds of dilemmas, not in contemporary Britain, but rather in the context of developments taking place in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I'll address how loyalty ebbed and flowed in practice. But in order to understand how British Muslims engaged with contemporary discourses on loyalty, we need to locate them within their social and political context. There is no doubt that post the post-Crimean War of 1854-56 and the so-called Indian Mutiny in 1857-58, in India and subcontinent South Asia, generally referred to as the Great Rebellion. Dislike of the Ottoman Turks, together with other Muslims and Islam per se, accelerated. As conflicts intensified in the Ottomans' Balkan domains, anti-Muslim sentiment in Britain rose sharply. Islam, along with the Ottoman Caliphate, were subjected to unrestrained popular and official ridicule and insults. issued from pulpits and platforms no less than in the press. Leading British politicians, especially Gladstone, a four-time Prime Minister, were increasingly vitriolic in their denunciation of Islam and the Ottoman Turks. The so-called Muslim mind, to which they frequently referred, was charged with being incapable of rational modern thought. Clergymen denounced Islam as that, and I quote, most nauseous abomination and the source of all wickedness. The Ottoman Sultan Caliph was caricatured as the Unspeakable Turk in the satirical magazine Punch. Such depictions were linked to and reflected more popular perceptions of Muslim despotism, corruption, religious fanaticism, sexual depravity, and inequality as captured in literature, painting, and travel writing. They were further accentuated by reports of major policy decisions, diplomatic initiatives, and military expeditions undertaken around the world in pursuit of British imperial interests. And they were reproduced in such accessible and mass media forms as newspaper cartoons, music hall songs, novels, and religious journals, in photograph and in time cinema. This fast-growing antagonism toward Islam and Muslims, perhaps not surprisingly, began to galvanize opinion among Muslims in Britain in defense of the Sultan Caliph as the key symbol of the Ummah, that is, the concept of worldwide Muslim community, which Muslims cherished as a key expression of their religious identity. As British foreign policy moved away from its 19th century support for the Ottomans in their guise as the sick man of Europe, several strands of pan-Islam emerged and converged as a potentially powerful and effective strategy with which to challenge and defy this dominant and potentially destructive British discourse. Among these British Muslims, I want to focus on two men who arguably intervened most vociferously and passionately in the debates of this period, namely Abdullah Quilliam, there on the left, particularly up to the point of his departure for Constantinople in 1908, and subsequently Marmaduke Pickthall, again up there, who, though considerably younger than Quilliam, died around the same time, 1936, 1932, 1936. Let me look at Quilliam first. Like many Victorians of this time, Quilliam, who was a solicitor with a substantial practice in Liverpool, had become increasingly doubtful of Orthodox Christian dogma, having first turned to Unitarianism and deism, which, like Islam, seemed to reject the belief in Trinity and encouraged inquiry through reason. It proved to be a short step to Islam, which, doctrinal similarities with Christianity notwithstanding, increasingly appeared to him to be a more reasonable, rational, and practical faith. In 1887, after a trip to Morocco, Quilliam converted to Islam, setting out his religious views in a pamphlet entitled The Faith of Islam. Quilliam was not a quiet Muslim. He was proud of his new religious identity, and he sought to spread the word. However, this propagation of his religious beliefs soon encountered intense hostility. Quilliam found himself insulted, ridiculed, and stigmatized. I quote him, as a species of monomaniac, with his critics calling him a lunatic, a fit case for a straitjacket. His faith was described as, and I quote, an exotic, un-English religion. Muhammad's creed was pronounced as Eastern humbug, which, as history had proved, had been hand in glove, again I quote, with cruelty, murder, moral and imperial decay, and barbarous ferocity. Quilliam was evicted from one premises and pelted with mud, missiles, and filth along with the worshippers leaving the mosque that he had set up in Liverpool. I've already described the context in which this vitriol against Quilliam and Islam was being generated. Almost symbiotically, the anti-Muslim sentiment was fueled by British foreign policy decisions, and so the stands taken by British governments in turn fed opposition to it among some British Muslims. Indeed, Quilliam's strand of pan-Islam ran directly counter to the glorification of imperial supremacy, especially the civilizing mission that was so popular at the time, given that a substantial number of natives supposedly benefiting from it were Muslims. After all, it was his belief in Islam's moral superiority to Christianity that had resulted in his conversion in the first place. His commitment to pan-Islam had been further deepened by the conferment upon him of scholarly, religious, and diplomatic titles and honors by Muslim rulers. Rather than fighting Muslims, in his view, Britain's imperial interest lay in developing peaceful relations with them. He saw Russia as the major strategic threat to Britain's wider imperial realm. And as Russian interests increasingly encroached on the Ottoman domains in Europe, he believed that an alliance with Turkey was eminently sensible from a British imperial perspective. Instead, what he saw were recurrent military campaigns being conducted against Muslims, particularly the major wars in Afghanistan, Sudan, and Egypt towards the end of the 19th century. So Quilliam, having concluded that, and I quote him, the Christian powers were preparing a new crusade, that's what he said, in order to shatter the Muslim powers under the pretext that they desired to civilize the world, unquote. Opposed Britain's military actions in Egypt and Sudan, and issued a series of defiant, potentially disloyal proclamations. On the Armenian question, for instance, Quilliam defended the Ottomans in 1895 from criticism that he regarded as unbalanced and unfair, when Gladstone tried to mobilize mass support for his demand that the government should take punitive measures against Turkey and eject it from Europe. This is what Gladstone said, bag and baggage. Quilliam preempted Gladstone's speech in Liverpool by calling a meeting of his congregation of fellow Muslims to redress the balance. As he put it, Britain's policy of siding with rebellions in the Balkans and Armenia was a Christian conspiracy against Islam aimed at breaking up the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, the symbolic center of the Muslim world and its believers. He talked of England virtually preaching a new crusade against Islam while hypocritically ignoring Christian atrocities elsewhere. In 1897, he similarly accused the British Christian logic of double standards, of extolling an American as a hero for killing innocent women and children in the crowded streets of Istanbul, while denouncing an Afghan fighting for his homeland. I quote him again, as a traitor and a rebel, even though his land was being raided and his wives and children slain. Quite interesting to think, well, does that ring a bell? Quilliam's warning that such a crusade might be answered with a jihad was dismissed by the British press as a hollow threat, and his criticisms were rejected as un-British or even treasonous. Quilliam was especially defiant in his defense of the successor to the Mahdi against British attempts to suppress the revolt in Sudan with Egyptian Muslim soldiers. Enraged by Kitchener's military campaign in the Sudan, he issued two so-called fatwas, or if you like, pronouncements. On the one hand, all too aware of domestic sensitivities, he sought to persuade Muslim imperial subjects against fighting. stating that and I quote him again, for any true believers to take up arms against other Muslims is against the law of God and his holy prophet. Soon after this, however, the Battle of Omdurman in 1898 would severely test Quilliam's already stretched loyalties. This was a battle in which 11,000 Sudanese were mowed down by British artillery. Even the jingoistic Daily Mail was moved to call it, and I quote from the Daily Mail, an appalling slaughter. Quilliam denounced more accurately this particular as, and I quote him, murder and nothing else. He protested against the desecration of the Mahdi's tomb by Kitchener's troops. In his word, they had, and I quote him, dragged the Mahdi's corpse from the grave and hacked off his head, throwing it in the river, and requested a parliamentary inquiry into this scandalous outrage, arguing that such desecration would only further stiffen local resistance to British authority. While stopping short of calling for insurgency against Britain, he had no qualms in doing so when the French crushed anti-colonial, i.e. Muslim resistance in Algeria. So this is what he was saying, in relation to Algeria. And he's clearly instigating Muslims there, saying, arise, brethren, and resist each and every one of these hypocritical, lying, thieving, murderous Christian nations. In 1904, Quilliam again practically exploded after the British victory in Somaliland. In a passionate but all the same ironic piece of writing, he chastised Christians for their hypocrisy, arguing what had become his usual case by now, that the military colonial thrusts into Muslim territory were masking a Christian war on Islam. So this is what appears in one of his journals and one of his magazines. Shout, hurrah, ye Britons, who thirst for blood and slaughter is so great. And then he ends it with shout, hurrah, ye devils and imps from hell, to whom blood and rapine and slaughter is congenial sport. Given such bold statements, it was unsurprising that there were widespread allegations that his Muslim faith took precedence over his loyalty to the crown. At times, what appeared to be the very real conflict of loyalties between Britain, and quote from him, the country to which we owe loyal allegiance as British subjects, and the Ottoman Empire, to whom we are also bound with ties of love and affection and the deepest feelings of religious sympathies. So between Britain and the Ottoman Empire, these provoked the demand that Quilliam be tried for treason. But confident about his twin loyalties, Quilliam remained unabashed and stubbornly unapologetic, allowing his, quote him, religious zeal to outrun his patriotism. After all, and here I want to quote what he had to say at some length, because it gives us a good feel for the way that he saw where his loyalties lay, in the plural lay. There is what he was saying about patriotism and his feelings about patriotism. And then sort of finishing off by talking about the man who places patriotism before religion cannot be a sincere Muslim. And the paramount duty of all Muslims was to work for the unity of Muslims and Islam, even at the expense of the nation. And then finally, be a crime to place duties before those of patriotism. Then, if that's the case, then I'm verily guilty. Nay, more, I glory in such guilt. So he's actually doing it in a very sort of what you call a very passionate way, privileging one over the other at this point in time. all this raises the question whether the charges of divided loyalties laid against Quilliam were entirely fair or not. In 1899, for Quilliam, it was perfectly possible to be a patriotic British Muslim, loyal to the Caliph and the Ummah. In his words, I quote him, "A native-born Briton and as a loyal Muslim subject of Her Majesty, as one proud of my country and its honourable traditions." Interestingly, Quilliam revered the British monarchy and, by extension, though with some reservations, the existing British Empire. There is considerable historical hard evidence for this. He offered, for example, special prayers on the occasion of Queen Victoria's birthday and celebrated her Diamond Jubilee at the Liverpool Muslim Institute in 1897. He even sent the Queen a celebratory telegram in which he offered her, I quote him, "the loyal felicitations of the British Muslims," and then published in his newspaper, The Crescent, what he called a Muslim anthem sung to the tune of the God Save the Queen. When Victoria died in 1901, he promptly sent another telegram conveying in his words the heartfelt condolences of British Muslims to Edward VII, whose portrait duly appeared on the cover of the next edition of another of his publications, Islamic World. Quilliam, as the loyal citizen and patriot that he believed himself to be, also believed that British imperial rule was benign and fair to the millions of the Crown's Muslim subjects. When the Boer War broke out in 1899, he argued that there were far greater likelihood of Muslim freedom of worship in South Africa under British rule than under the dominion of what he described as the fanatical Dutch Protestants. During the course of the Boer War, he proudly noted that several members of the LMI, Liverpool Muslim Institute, were fighting in the Transvaal, and that a Muslim sister was a nurse with the ambulance corps. On the announcement of the British victory in 1902, Quilliam quickly issued a proclamation in which he celebrated the honourable peace and glowingly praised the British nation for its military prowess. In this way, he showed that it was possible to be a Muslim who was highly critical of some aspects of British foreign policy, yet still someone who remained intensely patriotic to their country of birth. And this is quite interesting in terms of what he had to say about patriotism and its sort of engagement with thanking that victory, as far as the eternal ruler was concerned. Hence, as citizens of the British Empire, he demanded from Indian Muslims loyalty to the Queen, because for him, Muslims under the British Crown, wherever they lived, enjoyed benefits unparalleled elsewhere in the Muslim world. However, British support for various rebellions in the Balkans and Greece against Turkey, and hence much closer to the center of his Muslim world, was much, much more problematic. He did not understand why various foreign and colonial office officials in the final decades of the 19th century could not recognize the significance and benefits of alliance with Muslim nations, especially the Ottomans, so as to maintain strategic dominance over Britain's old enemies, Russia and France. Speaking as a self-proclaimed patriot, then Quilliam issued dire warnings against driving Turkey away from Britain and foretold the consequence of this in terms of turning millions of loyal Muslims in the colonies, according to him, into a phalanx of bitter foes. And that's another quote from him, which actually sort of reinforces what I've just been saying about his views. Quilliam's life then becomes a bit of a mystery. There are several years in the very early 20th century when he disappears off the historical radar. But in late 1909, he reappeared and returned to Britain from possibly Constantinople, now calling himself Leon, if you like, a French name. In contrast to his previous stance, he no longer pursued his defense of Islam or Muslim leaders as passionately as he had done before, with the Ottoman Sultan Abdulhamid II deposed by the Young Turks and Britain officially fighting Turkey by the end of 1914. He was more anxious than he had ever been in Liverpool to demonstrate his loyalty to crown and country, and in fact now repudiated his earlier rhetoric about religion taking precedence over patriotism, arguing that, and I quote him, "Our holy faith enjoins upon us to be loyal to whatever country under whose protection we reside." He wrote to Grey, the then Foreign Secretary, pledging his absolute loyalty to the British Crown, and moreover, offering his services to the government in promoting, quoting him, loyalty amongst the Muslims throughout the empire. So as to convey the genuineness of this loyalty, he also resigned as vice president of the Anglo-Ottoman Association, itself under suspicion for undesirable activities in relation to Turkey. For the rest of the First World War, Quilliam kept a low profile, though, intriguingly, one of many rumors that surfaced after his death in 1932 suggested he may have carried out valuable Secret Service work for England during this conflict. Yet, when the war ended, his efforts to ensure that a defeated and humiliated Turkey received a fair hearing at the post-war peace conferences still occasionally threatened to undermine his attempts to appear conspicuously loyal to Britain. Let me now turn to Marmaduke Pickthall, who, in my view, presents a more complex case, though it does reveal similar dilemmas to those encountered by Quilliam. Son of an Anglican rector, Pickthall initially hoped to become a soldier and join the Royal Engineers. Unsuccessful, he trained instead for the Levantine consular service, but failed again. He then spent 2 years in Palestine and Syria, acquiring a thorough knowledge of Arabic as well as the religions and customs of the region. So profound was the impact of these experiences that in 1895 he contemplated converting to Islam, but was discouraged by the Imam of the Central Mosque at Damascus, who thought the move to be premature. Returning to England in 1896, he married and settled down as an orthodox middle-class church-going writer. But his personal fondness for Muslims and appreciation of Islam remained. And increasingly, he deepened his intellectual and political engagement with Muslim peoples and societies. An ardent monarchist, and by his own admission, I quote him, a patriotic English Tory, Pickthall was inconsistent in his approach to the empire. He could be critical of British imperialism in India, yet while traveling in Egypt in 1907, he became a strong supporter of Lord Cromer's regime there. But then he was also deeply dismayed by what he regarded as Britain's reneging on its assurance given at Berlin back in 1878, guaranteeing the independence of the Ottoman Empire. Pickthall, it would seem, had come to admire what was happening in Ottoman lands, especially after the Young Turks had promised modernizing reforms on taking power in 1908. As he witnessed the Ottoman Empire crumbling, he became distressed by Britain's passivity when Italy invaded his Tripolitanian possessions in 1911. And likewise, its lack of support for Turkey's imperial sovereignty during the two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13. Pickthall found that he could no longer remain unmoved. In November 1912, soon after the eruption of the First Balkan War, he started writing a series of articles in a publication called New Age, collectively entitled The Black Crusade, in which he condemned the machinations of Christian powers in the affairs of the Ottoman Empire and proclaimed the Turks to be, and I quote him, by far the, by far the most advanced of Muslim races, mentally capable of attaining the highest civilization. Early in 1913, Pickthall traveled to Constantinople to observe for himself the unfolding crisis, and having not seen it reported in the British press, was shocked to learn of the scale of massacre of the Turks committed by the Balkan allies. Hugely impressed by the developments he saw in Turkey during his 4-month sojourn, he returned home convinced that, and again, there for you to look at what he was saying, Turkey, a country in close touch with Europe, was the head of the progressive movement in the East. If we cut off that head, as Russia, our ally, and other powers desired to do, 100 mad fanatics would rise. Instead of it, a monster would form, which would devour our children. More determined than ever to, quote him, to promote a cordial understanding between Great Britain and Turkey, on his return to London, he, along with Quilliam, Arthur Field, and Duse Muhammad Ali, the editor of the outspoken African Times and Orient Review, helped set up an Ottoman committee. From the end of 1913, he became even more closely involved with the Anglo-Ottoman Society, a body comprising a range of Muslim and Christian members, which, and I quote intelligence here, in British and continental political and press circles called for a European defense of Turkey. The Anglo-Ottoman Society provided Pickthall with a great opportunity to write and speak critically on British attitudes and policies towards Turkey's progressive Muslims. But from the amount of public ridicule, and I'm quoting him, public ridicule and private abuse he received, he knew that he was, again quoting him, defending an unpopular cause. All the same, he asserted that in being critical, he was actually being at heart patriotic. And this is what he was saying. As an Englishman who has the interests of the Mohammedan at heart, I'm a pro-Turk until the balance is adjusted. I confess that I cannot see England in a mean and at the same time ruinous course of policy. That's why I'm criticizing it, without emotion of a most decided kind. As the outbreak of the First World War approached, Pickthall tried desperately hard to persuade the British government to secure the neutrality of the Ottoman Empire. Along with many fellow British Muslims, he was disappointed in Britain's inability to prevent Turkey's alliance with Germany. Fellow convert John Parkinson expressed the unease regarding where his loyalty would lie if Turkey became an enemy. And this is John Parkinson was saying, as a British, I would support my country to bring matters to a victorious ending. I would regret the necessity that compelled me to fight against Turkey, on the other hand, are people with whom I sympathize on many national ideals and to whom I am bound. But in the end, our greater duty to our own empire is, to our own native land, is where the loyalties are going to be, and they are going to lie. So Turkey's entry in the war on the side of Germany and its proclamation of jihad in 1914, which called on Muslims all over the world to rise up against its enemies, would then again test the limits of Muslim loyalties in Britain. Pickthall was opposed to the war against Turkey, and as the conflict dragged on, he became avowedly pan-Islamic, arguing that pan-Islam, as he put it, and I quote him, "The conscious effort for the united progress made by educated Muslims was the cornerstone, in his view, of Disraeli's constructive Eastern policy. Should be supported, therefore. Indeed, for him, for patriotic reasons. Indeed, for him, Pan-Islam was, and I quote him again, the most hopeful movement of our day, deserving the support of all enlightened people, and particularly the British government, since a British government inspired it in the first place." On this basis, with a small but influential network of British Muslims, Pickthall initiated a pro-Turkish public campaign, primarily drawing on support from the Anglo-Ottoman Society and another group, the Central Islamic Society, in letters to newspapers, in protest meetings, in public debates and lectures, and in resolutions to the Foreign and India offices. He warned the British government of what he regarded as the malevolent Russian influence and ambitions, seeking to persuade ministers to agree a peace separately with the Ottoman Empire during the war. As we know, and he realized it at the time, all this effort proved in the longer run to be, I quote him again, pitifully futile. This did not put a stop to what his critics dismissed as his ravings, however. After the Russian Revolution of February 1917, the Anglo-Ottoman Society, with Pickthall as its chairman, expressed deep gratitude for the repudiation of democratic Russia of all those designs of territorial expansion, which made the policy of autocratic Russia the peace of Europe in the past a threat. When the British government set out the proposals to create a Jewish state in Palestine, Pickthall once more intervened regarding this taking of territory from the Muslim government to be, and I quote him again, a world disaster. Again, this had little effect, as the Balfour Declaration of November 1917 went on to promise British support for a national homeland for Jewish people in Palestine. Then, in late 1917, during the British-sponsored Arab Revolt, he wrote a letter to the Saturday Review, which, according to the Foreign Office, was likely to create bad feelings between Britain and its Arab allies, especially the Kingdom of Hijaz or the holy places of Islam, Mecca and Medina, by insinuating, and this is from intelligence sources, that our ally King Hussein, then ruler of the Hijaz and key British ally, is a venal traitor, sets the Arabs at variance, suggests that we have violated the holy territories, and goes on for pure Turco-philism, that is, love for the Turks. While Pickthall quickly repudiated the accusations regarding Turks' hatred of the Arabs, one contemporary intelligence report viewed his writings as, and I quote, a masterpiece of enemy propaganda. 3 months later, Pickthall again courted controversy when, in a challenging piece published in the radical anti-war newspaper Workers' Dreadnought, he accused, and I quote him, our present rulers of attempting to pit the Arab-speaking Muslims against the Turkish-speaking Muslims on, according to him, our false ideal of nationality and patriotism. In his view, the great division in Islam is that between progressive and reactionary. And we, at present, according to him, are supporting the reactionaries, i.e. the Grand Sheriff of Mecca, King Hussein. Clearly then, Pickthall represented a main voice of dissent among British Muslims during this period. And while the impact of his words, like that of his fellow critics, proved relatively inconsequential, he was undoubtedly seen as a thorn in the side of the British authorities, and on whom, along with the so-called, and this is quite interesting, again from intelligence papers, Woking Mosque gang, all of them and they kept a careful watch on. So according to the Foreign Office, the Woking Mosque gang was a body connected. This is the oldest mosque in Britain, going back to 1889. Khaja Kamaluddin, the Imam, part of this Woking mosque gang. So it's a body connected in various ways with a long-established mosque and centre of British Muslim worship at Woking that included, again, according to intelligence sources, such agitators as Pickthall and Arthur Field, and which is in communication with the most dangerous conspirators in this country and abroad. Pickthall was denounced as an enemy of Christendom, and the organizations to which he belonged were labeled anti-British. As intelligence reports explained, can I quote, "The only reason for tolerating Kidwai, an Indian Muslim living in Britain who in their view was the most dangerous, and Pickthall, is that we have never had sufficient ground on which to put a stop to their activities, though they make a practice of sailing very close to the wind," unquote. But interestingly, while Kidwai, these reports explain, could, in quoting, be looked upon as an enemy to this country, unquote, Pickthall, in contrast, and you might want to reflect on this, in contrast, again quoting, may be regarded as somewhat of a crank. But in all probability, at heart, he is a loyal British subject. This is what intelligence are telling us. Pickthall was himself troubled by the aspersions that were cast on his loyalty. He was acutely aware that he was regarded as a traitor to his country by some people, and this certainly caused him no small personal distress. And this is how he tried to sort of kind of rationalize it. I care so much about the British Empire in the East. And he goes on and talks about it. And in my small way, I've been, because of his patriotism, trying to make England realize that they are on the wrong path. As time and again, he insisted, I'm pro-Turk, but not anti-British. After the First World War was over, with the Ottoman Empire defeated, in theory at least, the tension between competing loyalties should have ended. But it did not, thanks to the continuing uncertainty over the ultimate fate of the Ottoman Sultan, Caliph, an outcome in which Britain had a key role to play. Pickthall joined other British Muslims to call on the government for a sympathetic hearing in response to Turkey, pleading for the preservation of the Ottoman Caliphate and opposing a hereditary Arab alternative that was being mooted by Britain. The latter, they insisted, ran the risk of, and I quote from him again, rousing very angry feelings in the Muslim world, and so would not be in Britain's best interest. This controversy, accordingly, kept alive the question of loyalty long after the war with Turkey had ended, because Muslims who argued Turkey's case seemed to be continuing to support strongly and energetically the place that had so recently been Britain's explicit and defeated enemy. So what conclusions can we draw from this admittedly brief potted history of two larger-than-life late 19th and early 20th British Muslims who lived through tumultuous times, arguably as challenging as the ones in which we today find ourselves? First, it seems to me that when we look at indigenous, if you like, convert British Muslims over 100 years ago, converts to Islam such as Quilliam and Pickthall But also other well-known individuals include Lord Headley, there on the left, Bertram Khalid Sheldrake, one of the sergeants in the war, and Dame Evelyn Cobbold from Scotland. Even when they were wrestling with the conflicted feelings regarding their attachments to Britain, found that their altruistic loyalty seemed to have a deeper emotional hold on them. Indeed, some among them perceived there to be no conflict whatsoever between their religious affiliation and loyalty to their nation. For instance, Lord Headley displayed little ambiguity in his repeated pronouncements of loyalty to the British Empire. He had no time for the Ottoman caliph's call for a global jihad against the Entente powers, asserting that this was not a religious war. Rather, he unhesitatingly proposed a resolution from the British Muslim Society, which at that time had in the region of 400 to 600 members, which stated, and we desire to offer our wholehearted congratulations and so on and so forth, because they were freely pouring out their lifeblood in defense of honor and for the love of truth and justice, and putting into effect the principles of Islam as inculcated, that's what he's saying, by the Holy Prophet Muhammad. So that's my first sort of kind of conclusion. Second, I would suggest that these stories underline just how complex and layered loyalty is. It is also contextual. It means different things to different people, but it also means different things to the same people at different times. This was the case for many people, not just Muslims in Britain. Most obviously, members of the Irish and Jewish communities here. We can talk about their sort of, if you like, contractual loyalties during the First World War, perhaps in the discussion. It also applied to Muslims, Sikhs, and Hindus facing similar challenges and potentially divided loyalties in other parts of the British Empire. So it wasn't just Muslims who were conflicted at that time. And so we need to kind of reflect on the nature of loyalties in that way. Put simply, what we can learn from looking at these past stories, what history shows us, is that Muslims during this period, like all of us here today, I would suggest, were shaped by and themselves helped to shape multiple loyalties, which sometimes competed and conflicted with each other. These loyalties ebbed and flowed depending on their changing circumstances. British Muslim loyalty to Imperial Britain 100 years ago was neither always unequivocal nor, for the most part, emotionally driven. For most of them, and certainly for Quilliam and Pickthall, when Britain was at war, the maxim, "my country, right or wrong," served in the final analysis as their primary moral injunction. While Quilliam, to all intents and purposes, ceased being a critical friend, which is what we started off with, no longer asking challenging questions, and instead fell largely silent in his public pronouncements. Pickthall, despite a more openly critical stance, did not resist being conscripted, this is what actually happened to him, in the last months of the empire, and dubbed unambiguously as Britain's most loyal enemy. Thank you.